On today's episode, we catch up from 2 weeks ago where we started to talk about the dry processing. We kind of finish up that episode, and one thing I realized is at the very end of our first part to dry processing, I think I had mentioned that the next week we would finish it. So we did skip a week. We put Christmas Coffee for a Crowd in there, so I apologize for that. But now you're about to hear the episode that concludes 2 weeks ago's episode. Welcome to
Bean stuff, because when you pick it, because it's on a tree,
right,
you're going to get some twigs. It may be stuff from the ground, even some stones, some cobwebs, whatever may be.
Cobwebs.
Well, I was thinking of spiders
That's
on
really
trees.
small.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, the tree spiders.
Yeah.
Oh my, those will ruin your cup.
Some really like them.
Tastes like chicken.
Oh yeah. But they take that bucket, and you're right. And now they need to tip it into something. Some will just tip it onto the ground and sort through manually and pick out those twigs and the stones and things.
Yeah.
Or you could sort it. There's different ways you can do that.
What's the one to do with this sieve, like a large circular sieve?
You'll see pictures of that, and that's true. And it's not made up. It's where they have the coffee cherries there, and they are very good at doing this. But they'll
toss it
in the air, and you'll see pictures of that as the cherries all go up. And also the twigs and stones go up, and what they're aiming at is the cherries will come down, and those twigs, and they'll blow. Is that called winnowing? I think
winnowing, yeah.
And those things go to the ground, and you've just started the sorting process. You can do it by manually, but some way you need to start getting those things. Again, you have a problem with a cup. Then if you've got a stone, well, there's a problem with the grinder.
And just real quick, you have a little box of things you've found in the green bean bags, even.
That's true.
And it is incredible, the range of stuff. There's cigarette butts.
Oh, there's all sorts. We
bullets.
found bullets. We found bullets in there.
That could be risky.
It could be risky
in many
ways.
Yeah.
That's right.
Kaboom.
Oh, mate. Oh, I should get paid danger money when I'm roasting. Marbles, are a lot of marbles in there. It's just amazing what you find there.
And that's after it's gone through all the process. So it's amazing.
Yeah, that's from
later on.
Yeah.
But even how much can get,
and there's a lot. Actually, one of the biggest things you'll have in that box is little bits of cement.
Huh.
And that's
is interesting.
The drying patio that we're going to get to. Hopefully one day we'll get to the drying patio. And as they rake that up and they get those beans back into like another container, they will rake up cement with it at the same time.
And obviously this part of the process is pretty much identical for all processes so far.
Yes, that's
to
true.
some extent.
Yep.
And this sorting, it can be done winnowing away.
I like that.
Manually by just sorting through it. I would assume that at a certain scale, there are people or places that do it mechanically as well.
Yes. Oh, yes. Very much so. And the more availability you have to the technology, then you can upgrade that quite a bit.
Right.
After you've done all that, then often, not always, but often it will go into some water.
Rinsing
it, which is another way of sorting it. And also the water, you get floaters, they call them, and some sink to the bottom, and now you take the floaters off because they're unripe. They don't have as much sugar, they're not as heavy, so they don't sink to the bottom.
Yeah.
And so and some have density sorters.
Interesting.
That's the basic idea of a density sorter. But that's another part of the process, that these coffee cherries that you've picked off the tree. And this is where it does start. This is kind of like where
the river forks.
Exactly.
All the different process. Because really, all of that's typical.
Yeah.
Ish. Esque. I'm so nervous to say that's exactly what it is, because there's always something.
You would be wrong.
Yeah, exactly. But this is where the dry process really takes the driver's seat.
Yep.
So the first thing is the beans are laid out.
Yes.
And now we're getting into some meat and potatoes.
Yes.
For differences in even the dry process.
Oh, it's amazing.
It's crazy how you have so many different process high that affect it, but there's also so many different techniques within that process.
Yes.
It's a lot.
So you lay it out, and when you say lay it out, what are you going? Because you're physically there.
Right.
You're going to empty these containers of coffee, however you've done that, sort it, and what are you going to lay it on?
Well, and here's a question: are you going to lay it on something that you have at your farm, or are you taking it somewhere? I would assume there's differences. I mean, you could do either depending on where you are.
If you don't have the space, you're going to need to take it to your neighbor or whoever you can.
Is an interesting piece again, because it adds more cost to the farmer if they have to take it somewhere and pay for that
transport again.
But let's say you've got a coffee farm.
Yes. By the way, I don't have a coffee farm, by the way, but
oh, dang it!
I've seen pictures even of in I think it was Indonesia, but of it being laid on the front footpath, let me call it, looked pretty rustic, but with cars zooming past and trucks zooming past, and they were drying their coffee probably more for their own use, but I got a feeling it was going to be passed on for commercial use.
Well, and that's another piece to it, is where you're drying it. What is the environment around that? And that can affect it hugely. Obviously, we have fruit think about what happens if you put a banana in a bag with anything else almost. You pull that thing out, you put it in a bag of coffee in there. The banana is its flavor or its scent is going to spread. So if we think of, not all coffee is right next to a banana, but there's other things that can hugely and drastically affect that flavor depending on the environment that the beans are sitting in.
And the two basic ones though will be what we call a patio. So it's like a large slab of concrete out there. And the other one that's becoming a little more common too is the raised bed. And that just means it's raised off the ground. So now you've got like a
almost like a
meshy sort of thing. Yeah. And you put these these cherries onto them, and you've now got the temperature can be controlled a little more because you've got airflow coming from underneath and on top, and you can sort of rake it, whatever. Hard to do on a mesh in some ways, but they do more like a trowel,
right?
And they can keep it turning over, so you're keeping a consistent temperature, which is harder if you put it onto a patio. There you do need to use a rake to keep turning over, otherwise the sun comes out, which is what you want, and the top part dries really nicely, but underneath it's still wet or got moisture going on in there.
And I think that's interesting. It's important to make sure that it does dry, and there's different, even different methods of, how dry and different things like that. But there's, the moisture within that could potentially cause mold, or it could potentially cause other issues that we don't want within our bean. And it's like, there's so many, like the bean is or the cherry is such a vulnerable.
It's delicate.
It's in a vulnerable state.
Vulnerable. That's a good word. Yes.
Because like you said, you have to rake it, and again, raking it if you're on just a concrete patio, that could pull up some of the concrete. It mixes in a lot with that. And so, you're introducing all these other factors that have the potential to change the flavor or just the consistency of it.
And that potential to change, another huge one we just take for granted is weather.
Yeah. How many times, in a winter or summer do you go, man, the weather is hotter or colder? And coffee doesn't adapt. It changes.
So, you can put the coffee out, and there's different amounts of weeks, and there's another thing the farmer needs to know. Is it going to be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks? But if it rains suddenly, it's going to change if it's 2, 3, or 4 weeks. It also means, what am I going to do with this water now that's pelting down on my coffee? It's changing the temperature of the cherry.
Right.
And what's your reaction to that? And one of the best things to do is to pull a tarpaulin or something over top of it, because you want to keep that rain off.
But then that traps in the moisture and the humidity within the bean there.
And are you going to? What happens if it happens in the middle of the night? You're going to get out of bed and put it over, and then the sun comes out. You want to take the tarpaulin off, otherwise you're going to get all this incubated sort of heat.
And especially in places where it is literally on a patio in the back. Yard ish, around.
That's true.
It's like, how do you temperature control that? You can't, and so you are super dependent on the weather. And drying times are typically 2 to 4 weeks. But like you said, if it rains, all of a sudden it's like, well, these are not dry, and they will not. We won't be able to hold them properly. And that kind of thing. So it's like there is so much there's so many variables. It's almost amazing that any of that actually lines up.
Funny you should say it, Reed. I've thought that many times that when you go into delve into something, you think, how on earth do we get this cup of coffee in the morning?
Right. How does this end up in my cup tasting anything?
Yeah.
Like, how does it taste
Let
good?
alone really good.
Right. We could all be drinking Robusta. It
Ooh.
would make more sense because it's more resilient. But
Mhm.
but we're not. We have this complexity of flavor, and it's like, man, someone's putting in some hard work. Lots of people.
And part of that hard work, then, if you're the farmer, and this is where I say you don't tend to think of all this happening many thousands of miles away in a different country,
Right.
different people, you don't even know them.
Right.
But this is his livelihood or her livelihood,
Right.
how do they know when the 2, 3, 4 weeks is up?
Right.
When do they know it's dry enough and it's not too dry, it's not over dry?
And consistency year to year.
Well, that's another whole topic.
'Cause
You've got to do it all again next year, and the weather
using-
pattern's going to be different.
Right. And using that dry process, you are dependent on the weather. So like you said, the weather's going to be different. And then the time or when you determine that it's ripe, not ripe as fruit, but I guess ripe
Yes.
in the drying stage
Mhm.
to pull and then to move along in that process. How do you know if you're pulling it at the same rate of dryness or those kind of aspects? It's amazing. And that goes into all of our, like cupping. It's why that's important and stuff. But what I wanted to highlight as well is why the dry process, or one of the interesting parts of that dry process, and we kind of alluded to it earlier, but the bean or the skin of the bean acts as an incubator for the entire like internals of the fruit.
It's quite amazing when you think about it like that, is that you've got the skin, then you've got mucilage underneath the fruit or the coffee, and then you've got the seed under that.
Gross sometimes. It sounds like someone's sneezing.
Oh, sorry. I get quite excited by it. Anyway.
The mucilage, mate.
Useless. It does see where you're going there.
Sounds like mucus.
But you get the okay.
Kinda
I'm glad you just put that out there like that. That's great. We can edit that later. But the sun comes out and there's no clouds, there's no rain. The sun comes out and it heats. It goes through the skin and heats up that mucilage. Sorry, the fruit, if you want me to call it that.
No, mucilage is fine.
And it heats that up, and that starts to become more liquid-like. And where does the liquid go? The skin holds it in there, and in it goes to the seed. And this is one of the big positives of the natural process. And that fruit, which has flavor to it, has sugar, has lots of things going on in there, now is enabled in some way to go into the seed itself.
Right. And it's almost like it's infusing. It's like, it's like brining a turkey.
Ooh, yeah.
Where I think this is what brining a turkey is, but basically you cover it with, different like, maybe I don't know what it is, but you do different broths or different things to soak moisture into the bird, and then you cook it and so it doesn't dry out.
Exactly.
But it's kind of that process of you are using what's around it to soak into it so that you can absorb all the flavor from that
That's
fruit.
true. Another example would also be red and white wine.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I don't know so much about this. People can write in and say, hey, that's not how it works, or yes, that's work, or did you understand this part of it?
Have you ever had wine?
Yeah, that's right. And the red wine, I believe, it takes in the skin, and the whole product is in the beverage. That's why it's red, possibly, compared to white wine that leaves out the skin out and the tannins are not there, and therefore it's white. But that has a real effect on whether you like red or white wine. This is going to have a real effect on whether you like natural process or wet process.
Yeah, and it's that's a good example of how those differences, like you think of red and white wine, and there's a large, like you think of a really big difference in wine, and coffee is the same. I mean, there is a lot of difference within the two ways you process. Like if you can get two coffees processed two different ways,
Brilliant.
It's an interesting taste test because they are really different.
You almost say, is this the same coffee? This is amazing that they can get that tweak that they do there. They can, from the genetics, it is changed in some way enough to me go, wow, these are different.
Right.
Which would take us on to, how does the farmer choose, therefore, if he can do both, or she can do both,
Right.
why would you choose one rather
Yeah, why would
And
you
the other.
do why would you do the dry process over, a wet process, a honey process, a semi-pulp? Why would you go with the dry process? One of the first things that comes to my mind is it's simple. There's not a lot of equipment needed other than space
Yes.
and flat ground.
That's right. That's a big one.
And I mean, and in some cases, that's a big ask. That's there you might be in a mountainous terrain where you just don't have that. It is organic.
It's organic.
I mean, you're not adding anything,
Yep.
literally.
And it's, in a sense, simple in terms of you through generational, you can be told and
Right.
taught how to do it, and you can do it. You don't have all the equipment that some other farmer may have, but you've learnt through your father or your mother or whoever, you have learnt that this can be done in our back little yard, however many hectares it is. I could do this.
And I think that's an important piece of it too, because I think it really, like, as we start to go through these in different episodes, it is obviously the quote unquote simplest, or I don't know if easiest is the right word, because there's definitely not anything easy about it. But I think what's interesting is that it doesn't necessarily mean it's worse or it doesn't taste as good. I think, in some cases it can have better taste. Obviously that's subjective to the person tasting the coffee, whoever's roasting it.
Right.
But you know what it seems like? It's almost like a recipe that there is nothing written down for. Like it's like, oh, grandma passed this recipe down for this apple pie or this curry recipe. And it's like, there is no recipe, but it's been passed down generation after generation. And while, Betty Crocker might have a good recipe in there that's written out, so it's a different process, the one that's passed down is a more intuitive kind of feel it out. So and there's benefits to both. I mean, someone might come over for dinner and say, this is disgusting. I'm thinking of a soup that you made once.
Moving on.
but at the same time, it may have qualities that are better depending on who you are, that kind of thing. So I did want to highlight that it doesn't necessarily, just because it's simple, just because it's
exactly
the most cost effective or whatever, doesn't mean that it's the worst.
And it's getting so much better as we learn some of the science. Hopefully some science gets trickled back into that learning process you're talking about and saying, actually, if we do it for 3 weeks rather than 2 weeks, what's the difference? What's it taste? Oh, this is much better.
Well, and it's interesting too, because I think let's say you go to a coffee shop and you really like the coffee. So anybody out there, this is a challenge. I would say it'd be interesting to drink it again, because that would be good. I would hope.
Yes.
Once you've done that, ask the barista, do you know if this is a natural or what process this is? And maybe not every barista is going to know.
No.
You are going to look like an absolute coffee genius at the coffee shop. But I think it would also be interesting for you to know what you're drinking. Then if you find one that you don't like, but it's also, maybe at the same coffee shop, you don't like that specific coffee, or at a different coffee shop, they're making good coffee, they're doing a good job, but you just don't like the taste. Ask them again and see if the process is different.
Wow, you're starting to do something we said once before. You're starting to think about your coffee and realizing, if I think about that, I can realize I can have even a better cup than I had yesterday.
Oh, I think that's with coffee. I was chatting with someone on Instagram recently, and they had mentioned that, just wow, if you just stop and think, for, just pause for a second and think, there's so much to coffee. And we just got done going through some of the botany side of it, and it's just, even in that, there's so much. It's a whole lot.
Getting back to what we were saying about, so how does the farmer decide?
How do they decide? What are the things they're looking at?
I would say they're looking at how much rain is in the forecast, if they're able to see the forecast.
Right.
But if there's a lot of rain around, they're probably going to say, no, let's not do natural processes. If they have,
because it may not be the most reliable way to do it year to year.
I mean, if you too much rain, you're going to get the coffee cherries are going to perhaps start splitting. You're going to have to change your period of time that you have the coffee beans, coffee cherries sitting out there on the patio, wherever they are. If you've got a little bit of rain, it's really hot, then you think, this could be a good time to do some natural. If you have, again, that's a luxury. Some just have to do it the same way every time.
Do some farms year to year change?
I'm not sure so much how they change, but they have different parts of the farm. They do different things. I'm sure some do change, but I think they probably get really good at one, and that's their bulk bread and butter, and then they can start doing some other, and that could become the bread and butter as well. But
Yeah.
I think there's little things. I remember looking on some of the Brazilian farms, and you see some of the dried cherries look like raisins almost.
They do. They shrivel up.
They
and they're
shrivel up,
really dark.
and but then you've got some wet process going on as well. You're like, oh, that's different again. So some of the bigger farms perhaps have the ability to do a bit of both, or some of the different processes, the honey, whatever it may be.
And I think it depends on size of farm as well.
Yeah,
how
very
much they
much
have
so.
to process. What are some of the negative aspects of? I mean, we've talked and tried to kind of crusaded for the the benefits and how it's not a poor man's method of processing, but there are risks, and that's the same with every method. But
Yes.
what are some of the major risks with the dry process?
Yeah, and you're right. This one potentially, I was going to say, has a few more possibilities to go wrong, which is not so nice. But one, you could over dry the cherry.
And what would that do to the flavor if you over dry it?
Well, if you overdrive the cherry, it's going to become brittle, and it's really going to be not going to be able to go through the hulling process, which is just sort of like scraping those layers off. It's so brittle that the whole thing's just going to come apart as such, and you're going to lose the whole integrity of the bean.
Right.
And
so it may not actually make it past the other stages of the process.
Yes, the hulling, which
towards
comes
getting-
later. Yeah. The another one would be it's going to be too moist.
Right.
And once you get too much moisture in there, if you haven't got the timing right as such, and you may not have ever heard of a refractometer that can you can put it in there and see what the sugar content is, and
Good stuff.
yeah. And
But you can use that to check the contents, kind of the composition of the bean there.
But a lot of people won't have one of those, and therefore, if it's too moist, you got now a big possibility of mold growing.
That's true.
On the outside of the cherry, it can ruin your whole harvest as such.
Well, and then you have it could start fermenting.
That's a big one. That is a big one, and you're right. And that's part of this natural process. That is the balance there of how do you not go too far and ferment. You may want a little bit, but you don't want too much.
Right. You start really throwing the numbers, and balance can get thrown. Like I think
it's a balancing act at that point. Yes.
You mentioned you don't know much about red wine, but you also suggested that the fermentation part could be like too many tannins in wine.
I did say that.
That's a pretty big word for a non-wine guy.
I know. I do my
tannins, man.
I do my reading.
But there are those risks, and again, there's risks with all different processes, but those are some big ones. And I think that with the dry process, there's no marker for like it's done. I mean, there is, but it's not like you have a very you have to choose that point.
And the other process, like the wet one, we're going to get to that one day. But they have the same problem of when do you stop the fermentation on the tank?
Yeah,
there's the word again. They want fermentation, but you can have too much, and it can go badly wrong on you.
Get into now.
Yes,
the bulk of why it matters is how does it affect the cup?
Oh,
as the consumer, I'm sitting in a coffee shop right now.
Yep.
I'm drinking a cup of dry processed, natural processed Ethiopian Yirgacheffe.
Oh, yes.
Oh, it's good stuff. I just had it as a pour over. Oh, it's delicious.
Probably more likely to be a hurrah, but that's all right.
Or I'm having a hurrah.
Yeah.
I have it through an AeroPress. I'm just sitting there. I'm sipping. I'm enjoying.
Yes.
I'm thinking, why the heck do I even care how it's processed? It tastes good. What is dry process? How is dry process? How is the natural process going to impact the flavor of my cup?
I mean, that is the question. That is a good question. And my simple answer, it is going to affect tremendously your cup of what you actually passes your lips, goes onto your taste buds, and you're going to go, whoa, or ugh. One of those two things.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think you were saying with natural coffees, and again, this is a bit of a generalization because not every single coffee from every country is going to have the same flavor.
Yes.
Shocker. But natural coffee flavor profiles, what can we kind of generalize to expect within those flavor I think of like
Yes.
diversity.
Diversity is a good word for a natural.
Bold.
And I've heard lots of words used out there, and I've tasted a lot of these words, which I'm
What
very
do words
fortunate.
taste like?
Oh, mate.
Are the more syllables they have, does it have a more complex taste?
the more adjectives you can get into it, it's great.
Different languages have a different zest.
They do. There you go. But I would say for typical words I've heard out there and tasted,
Yeah.
is you've got fruity flavors is often used.
Yeah.
You've got sweet and intense fruity notes. I'm using the word fruity again.
Yeah.
Sometimes citrusy, a lime acidity they would talk about. Here's one of my favorites. And you often hear it in the hurrah when you mention, you'll hear this in the natural process, has a strong, sweet strawberry jam. Can you imagine?
I think I need to get up and get like some kind of biscotti or something now with my strawberry jam.
Woo, there you go, mate.
Well, and I think it's interesting that even that process can have some generalizations towards its kind of profile for the bean.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, especially if you have a certain type of bean that has some of those kind of flavors in its profile naturally, that dry process may help to accentuate that a little bit more.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I got to add a few more, Reed.
Yeah. Go for it.
Tropical fruit, bergamot, black tea, dry chocolate. Oh, I read this bean of Gold Mountain coffee growers said some of our naturals end up tasting more like a tropical fruit salad or fruit compoti than coffee.
Wow. We had that geisha blend from Indaba.
Yes.
And if you haven't checked out Indaba, check him out. Great coffee and good roaster. It's a good roaster. Tim Olmquist. He was on the
there we go.
podcast.
Yeah.
But you open up the bag and just boom. It was just like it was almost like laying out blueberries on the table. Now I have no idea what process it was because I forgot to look.
Probably natural.
But it is interesting how the process you choose that might be also part of the choice you have for it. If you're cupping, if the grower has the opportunity to cup his roasted coffee, he may choose different processes based on its flavor.
Yeah. And we in our culture, we get the barista who's up front, who you see, who you buy your coffee, who makes your coffee for you.
Is that who that is?
Yeah, that's the barista. For you, Reed, that's me in the morning.
Did they make words as well that are tasty?
No, that's the roaster. No, the baristas do.
Yeah.
And they can control the cup of coffee with their jugs and kettles and boiling and scales.
Sounds like a DJ.
Yeah, it is a bit. But what they probably do realize, but the fate of those beans or the success of those beans was sealed way earlier, and it's what we're talking about while it's still green in its green state many thousands of miles away. And that's when what we're talking about actually produce the flavor that the barista is tweaking, that the roaster tweaks, but it came from the farm, from this plant called the coffee.
And I think that's probably another, a piece that's important, especially if you are a barista, if you are making coffee, anybody really, is understanding that process, because it does seal in somewhat of the fate of the bean itself. So, it's in some ways helpful to know that, we're getting this new coffee, and what kind of coffee is it? And it may change the process you do. If you're making it at home, you might say, I'm going to do a pour over instead of through the espresso machine, or different ways of doing it.
I mean, that's a really good point too, Reed, because you get these different coffees we've been talking about here, we're talking about natural, and some of those flavors I talked about are going to be tweaked by a Chemex, by a pour over, by a AeroPress, by an espresso, definitely, by a mocha pot. It's going to tweak it, so you will bring out whatever method you used at the end product to make your coffee is going to just finish the whole process off, from the farm to the roaster to the where you bought your coffee to home. Suddenly you go, yes, we've all done a great job.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. And I just thought of an interesting fact that we had chatted about that I forgot to infuse into the podcast.
Good word.
Tasty word. Is that the natural process or dry process was actually banned in some countries.
That's right. It got a bad rap. And
such a stigma.
The stigma, that's another word for it. And partly because of those negatives we were talking about, and it could sort of really ruin stuff. And when you talk about a whole country, the country wants to export their coffee possibly. They don't want to get that bad rap. So they banned it. I think I was reading, I don't know, Rwanda and Burundi, some of those places that I think it may be changing now.
Right.
But some countries just said, no, we're not going to, that's too risky. We're not going to do that.
And that's an interesting part of it as well, is some of that decision might be based on, hey, I don't know if we can make this or guarantee this is going to turn out well. And if this is ruined, I'm sunk. I have nothing to fall back on. So it's like part of that decision process is based on not necessarily just the profit, but like, will I profit from this? I
Exactly.
guess that is the profit, but it's
the good news there is that I think some places that whether it's banned or not, around the world, they're experimenting some of these different processes from different countries, different beans from different countries. And they're putting it out there and saying, actually, this could work. This is why it hasn't worked. This is why it could work. In fact, in this country, it works even better. Well, that's a good news story.
Yeah, I mean, so that's kind of a I'm sure we could spend weeks on the dry process. I mean, there's so much more to it, I guess.
I like to go back to botany, mate.
Let's go back to botany for a couple.
I never liked that at school, but
but that's kind of an overview of the dry process, what it is, how it affects your bean, what's important about that, and why. You got something?
Just the last thing I would say is too, if you roast your own, you're going to look at the notes that the roaster or where you get your green beans from.
Yeah.
Or if you're buying a packet of coffee, I would suggest not only looking at the flavor notes, but turning the bag over, upside down, wherever it is.
Wherever it's printed.
Look at what the process is and say,
interesting,
these two are both natural. This one's not. I'm going to try this one. And just to make you think again, actually the process has a huge impact on that final flavor and that final cup of coffee.
Well, here's a question for you. Do different types of processed or different processes for coffee affect how you roast them?
Oh, yes, they do. It's a huge one. That's a very important question a roaster needs to ask himself. Yes. Simple answer is if you've got a natural, they can be softer. Therefore, you need to go slower, like you're doing the scones in the oven. You don't want to burn the outside and not cook the inside. You want to just slowly. So you can see that's a big topic, mainly for the roaster has to know how to roast that processed coffee. Sure, there's elevation, there's density in there as well, which is all part of it. But the process is the starting point. Say, okay, this Brazil is a natural. Okay, that's a good thing to know, and where I'm going to start this roast, what temperature I'm going to start it at.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge thing that, like, so you would say with naturals, they're generally a softer bean when you roast?
Typically, and that makes sense when you think about how the sun's come out,
they're
juices
almost
are gone
sitting in their own, a bath of their own mucilage for a while.
And another big one, as I say, density's in as well, how high it was growing and things like that. That's important. But the process is going to have an impact on that very thing you talk about.
Yeah, so it's not just flavor, it is roasting, it is everything, really. But yeah, that kind of wraps up our episode for dry process. Again, if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out to us. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast wherever you get it. Apple Podcasts is where I subscribe to a lot of mine. And leave us a little comment. Tell us how we're doing. But again, beanstuff.com, all our stuff's there. Feel free to check us out. Send us a comment or a request. But thank you so much for listening, for getting to this part of the podcast. We really enjoy making these for you, and we hope that they're helpful. But we will, Bean Stuff out.